Welcome back. Well, as you've heard in the news, the Republicans now in control of both houses of Congress in the US after the midterm elections overnight. Here to discuss the ramifications for Americans and the rest of the world, I'm joined by Professor Charles Shipan, Visiting Fellow at the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney and a Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan. And from Adelaide, the Chair of the Strategic Policy Institute and former Labor Senator, Stephen Loosley. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks, Janine.
Now, it was pretty well expected. The polls, all the early polls have been showing that the Republicans would gain the Senate back. I want to ask you first both, any surprises? What surprised you most out of what was an expected result? Charles?
Well, what I think the most surprising thing is there were a range of possible outcomes from today, and this ended up being across the board at the bad end of the range for Democrats. So they were predicted to lose some seats in the Senate, but they lost about as many as anybody would have thought. They were predicted to lose some seats in the House. They're going to do that. And they were predicted to lose some governorships and win some, and they've lost a lot of those. The key thing, I think, is that all the races they were expected to lose, they did lose. All the races that were expected to be close, they lost. And of the races that they expected to win, they lost some of those too.
So in other words, no good news for them.
There were a few bright spots. Jeanne Shaheen won the Senate race in New Hampshire, and so that was a bit of a surprise that she held on. And there were a few things like that, but not very many.
No, not much good news. Stephen, what was your take on it?
I
As an
think
old
Charles
US watcher yourself.
I think Charles is close to the money. The surprise for me was the scale of the Republican margins where they did win, and it's pretty comprehensive. Now, in US politics and the history of the Republic, midterms have often been a repudiation of the administration of the day, a chance for voters to give the president a kick in the pants, and that's certainly occurred here, no question about that. It does set up an interesting dynamic for 2016, for the presidential year. It remains to be seen how the Republicans will behave in control of both the House and the Senate. These warm and worthy sentiments of cooperation and reaching across the aisle, we've heard that frequently over the last several years. It's not really materialised, so we may see a situation in which the gridlock in the House and Senate simply becomes gridlock between Capitol Hill and 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. But to my mind, it was the scale of the losses, not only in the House and Senate, but in gubernatorial races where governors were under a lot of pressure from the Republican side. They've emerged and won quite comfortably, like Scott Walker in Wisconsin and Sam Brownback out in Kansas.
Yeah, the Sam Brownback one in Kansas stuns me because he was doing the experiment which one would hope they're not going to try nationally, where he slashed income taxes and virtually sent the state broke. They've got a huge deficit. It's so bad that a number of Republican politicians actually campaigned for a Democrat. So here is a state where they're seeing their economy implode, and yet they still voted for him.
But it is a traditional red state, and we ought to bear that in mind, that most of the Republican gains have occurred in states that were carried by Mitt Romney 2 years ago. I think that's useful to bear in mind. You do hit upon an interesting point, though, Janine, that whatever the Republicans are going to attempt to do in the House and Senate, where they now have majorities, from trying to roll back Obamacare right through to foreign and defence policy, they're going to run up against the US budget. They've argued for the last several years that the deficit's too large, American debt is too great, there's got to be cutbacks in government spending. It's going to be fascinating to see where those cutbacks occur, if at all. They certainly won't consider raising taxes.
No.
They've made that very clear.
Charles,
but it's going to be very interesting to see how they behave on the budget.
Charles, you're working on a paper on bipartisanship. I don't think that's a word we're going to hear a lot of, are we, in the next 2 years?
Well, we've been hearing an awful lot about it over the past few years.
Sorry, we hear the word, we don't get any action on it.
That's a fair way of talking about it. So, yes, I am working on a project on this, and I've uncovered some interesting things over time. One, for example, is that Congresses tend to be most productive actually in situations like we're moving into. That is, where one party controls the House and Senate and the other party controls the presidency. And it's under those circumstances that Congress has actually been a little bit more productive. So that's one interesting thing that I've uncovered so far. A second thing that I think has been interesting is there have been increasing calls for bipartisanship over time, with Republicans arguing that if only Obama would behave in a more bipartisan fashion, things would get done, and Obama saying that it's on the Republicans in Congress to act in a bipartisan fashion. What I think is going to be interesting going forward is whether or not Congress will be able to find some issues where they can behave in a bipartisan fashion. So if I can just add one more thing on that, the trick is that the Republicans themselves are going to have trouble agreeing on some of these things.
That's the issue, isn't it, Charles? That it's not Republicans versus Democrats. Where we've seen most of the problems is Republicans versus Republicans. We saw with the government shutdown, they have real problems controlling the extreme elements. Ted Cruz said even in the days before the election, if you thought it was bad before, wait till you see what we're going to do now. They're not sounding conciliatory.
Yeah, and I think there are a couple issues where right now people are hoping that Congress will get its act together and pass policies, and I simply don't see it. One of these is immigration. Now, there's probably a fair amount of ground on which the parties could agree, but if Republicans such as John Boehner or Mitch McConnell try to put forth something like that, there's a very strong nativist group within Congress, ones who are very anti-immigration, and they are simply not going to stand for it. And so they're going to run across that on issues related to immigration or anything related to taxes.
Yeah, as Stephen said, they just will not countenance anything.
Stephen raised a very good point on that, and I think it's absolutely right. So there are a number of issues where there could be room for a corporate tax reform. But as soon as they start doing things like closing loopholes, that will be interpreted by some in the Republican Party as a tax increase, and they are going to fight hard against that.
And of course, the domestic economy does affect the rest of the world. What happens in the US, they were just starting to come out of the post-GFC doldrums. The green shoots were there. Anything that jeopardises that recovery with these supply-side economical voodoo economics, as George Bush called it, would have an impact on Australia, wouldn't it, Stephen?
It will, although there's some good news here, I think, and I'll be interested in Charles's view on this. On the Trans-Pacific Partnership, on the TPP, I think we might actually see some progress there. It's really important to Australia and the region and to global trade. The administration, including the President, is well disposed towards the nations of this region, including Australia, negotiating a trade agreement with the US. Harry Reid, the former majority leader, would not grant fast-track negotiating status to the administration. It's just possible that the Republicans who tend to be more enlightened on these trade issues may see the TPP given trade promotion status. If that's the case, that could well work for Australia. And I know there are some very senior policymakers in Canberra really hope that this will be the case and trust that it will be and see positive signs in that regard.
Charles, I see you nodding. Is this one area, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that you think we might see that word bipartisanship come through?
I think absolutely. I think Stephen's spot on with the idea that Harry Reid has been the person blocking this on behalf of his constituent partisans, right? That other Democrats don't want to see this go forward, but Obama is in favor of it. There is a strong sense of turning toward Asia. And the TPP is an example where I think that there is common ground between what Obama wants to accomplish and what the Republicans in Congress want to accomplish.
Stephen, you look at security issues, foreign relations. We were both in Washington only a few months ago at the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue, where they were the message there was about the Republicans moving to a more isolationist stance on foreign affairs. From a foreign affairs viewpoint, what does this change mean?
Well, this really is going to be a serious internal debate for the Republicans. People may well be aware that currently, according to virtually every poll, the current Republican front runner for the nomination for the President in 2016 is Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky. Now, he's a libertarian like his father, the former congressman from Texas who was an inveterate candidate for president. But Rand Paul is much more serious than his dad ever could be. Now, he's not only in favour of a much smaller United States federal government, he's in favour of a much smaller presence of the United States around the world. Now, that puts him in direct conflict with the international wing of the party, represented, I think, most regularly by Senator John McCain, Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina. The Republicans are really going to have to work this out. I think Charles is right on Asia and the rebalance, and the Republicans may well argue for greater weight, now, not only in military terms but in diplomatic terms, to be given the American presence in the Indo-Pacific regions. But in terms of foreign policy generally, I think we're going to see a really a quite spirited debate inside the Republican Party between those who tend to be aligned with Senator Rand Paul and those who are the international wing, the Senator McCain's and the Senator Lindsey Graham's and others.
Charles, this fight between isolationism and the hawks and the people who want to get out there into Iraq, boots on ground, who's going to win this debate, do you think?
Oh, that's something that they're going to have to work out within Congress. And I don't envy the position that the leaders of this House and Senate are in, because as Stephen rightly pointed out, there is a very strong isolationist group. Also, in today's election, a number of the Republicans that won House seats tend to come from more of the Tea Party side of things, which is more isolationist. And so that's going to put increasing pressure on Boehner. Now, even when they can agree on things, I think there are going to be some difficulties agreeing with Obama. And the example here that I'm thinking of has to do with Iran and its nuclear program. In this case, it's clear that both sides want to curtail Iran's nuclear program, and they think that sanctions should be involved. But they want to use very different ways of getting there. Obama's take would be to use a carrot. Basically, what he would say is that we'll promise them that we'll loosen up on international sanctions if they agree to curtail some of their program. Republicans want to use a stick, which is to threaten them with sanctions, more sanctions, until they lighten up on their program.
Stephen, so summing up, from an Australian point of view, we can take some comfort. The TPP might look more likely today, but overall, from a point of view of an ally, someone who's working with them in Iraq and, as we said, whose economy is very dependent on them, how should we be feeling tonight?
Well, the global system, the international political and strategic system works best when America leads. And one of the reasons that Obama's standing has fallen into disrepair with the American electorate is on some of the issues that are of concern, he's been perceived, rightly or wrongly, as not leading. Now, I fear that with the Republicans dominating Capitol Hill and a Democrat in the White House, we'll see a good deal more American indecision. That being the case, that's a poor result. There are some issues, as we've discussed, like TPP, where for Australia it's going to work. In terms of rebalancing to Asia, I think that that continues, but it really is going to be a difficult situation over the next couple of years, I suspect, with the gridlock simply being transferred out of Capitol Hill to the space between the Congress and the administration.
And Charles, from an American point of view, I must say as an outsider, I don't quite understand. 2 years ago, Barack Obama was elected quite convincingly. He's brought them back from the brink of financial collapse. The economy is recovering, too slow for some. Gridlock has been caused as much by Republicans as others. What were they thinking in the vote?
It is a little puzzling when you put it that way, and I can add a couple more things to that. The deficit has dropped from $1.4 trillion to about $500 billion. The unemployment rate has dropped from 10% down to, I think, 5.9%.
Yeah, less than Australia.
Right, and they've had more economic growth than any other country post the economic collapse.
So what do the voters think is going to happen tomorrow?
Yeah, and I think that the big issue there is a sense of competence has been lost. That the White House used to have a reputation for competence, and they've lost that. In some ways, I think this is maybe over-attributing it to one thing, but when Obama created the health care program, when the Congress created it, the rollout of that was a disaster. And between that and some other things, Republicans were able to start chipping away at this idea that that Obama was a competent leader. They've been hammering on that. And so I think what voters today were doing was saying that they want some sort of change. The tricky thing is they're saying what they want to change from, but it's not clear what they want to change toward.
I think there's a lot of comparisons with what we're all going through in our political systems.
Yes.
A lot of irrational thinking and, yeah. Who knows where we're heading. Professor Charles Shipan, thanks for your time tonight.
Thank you.
And thank you to you, Stephen Loosley.
Thanks, Janine. Good night, Charles.
Good night, Stephen.
And we'll be moving to the local Senate, finding out what's happening there. As I said, I hope we're looking a lot better than the US tonight. We'll be talking with Nick Xenophon after this break.